everyone, and welcome to our Dialog Yoga series. This is Shakti Prasad, Manager Business Operations within the Product Engineering vertical. We have with us today Vikram Khanna, the VP of Customer Success at Innovation, who over the next few minutes is going to speak about business processes and help us understand the whys and the whats and the hows. Vikram comes with more than 15 years of experience spanning across industry stalwarts like Intel, Google, and McKinsey. And I, for one, am excited to dive deep into his years of exposure and hear about his personal experiences to help us better relate to our topic today. So without further wait, let's get into it. Business processes. Vikram, why do we need them?
Thanks, Shakti. And firstly, very happy to be here and talk about a topic that's actually personally close to me because I started my career as a process engineer, and that's where I built my foundations of what business processes are. And it's an interesting question you ask because it can be skinned in many ways. But before I answer that question, right, I always like to answer why do we need business processes, basically, before I answer what a business process is. Then, Shakti, any company, any small company, mid-sized company, or any function or new business unit, as they try to cross this proverbial chasm and try to become mainstream, one of the things they need to do is basically establish a best-in-class operating model. And the reason they need to do that is because they want to be able to scale effectively, in compliance, safely, with high quality and with profitability. They should be able to innovate, and it's counterproductive to, or rather counterintuitive to think about process with innovation. But once you establish a best-in-class operating model, you take care of the daily firefighting, and you can focus on things that matter and are important, basically. And then the third reason you need to establish this best-in-class operating model is so that you can drive some accountability, some sort of measurability, and some sort of hygiene in your overall business. And what does a best-in-class operating model look like? So assume that, a company or a business unit, they've set their strategy. An operating model is essentially defined by how do you achieve that strategy by establishing some objectives? How do you hire the right talent, basically, to help achieve those objectives? How do you map the journeys and processes of your company so that you can move towards those objectives? And what systems and tools and infrastructure you put in place to essentially help you to enable those objectives and the strategic goals that you have set for yourself? So if we just park people talent, which is actually the most important thing for me, at least, but if we park that for maybe another podcast, and if we park infrastructure and systems, let's maybe focus a little bit about processes here. And that's the why of why business processes are required. They're a basic core of this best-in-class operating model. So let me just move to the next step here. And let me just talk about what a business process is, basically, right? And if I were to quote the father of capitalism, Adam Smith, he would define it as a collection of interrelated tasks, that are initiated in response to achieving a goal, like I mentioned, your business objectives. But if you sort of cut through this corporate tranquilizers, right, it's essentially a way to achieve efficiency, scalability, and productivity in a way. And you do a couple of things sequentially to get to these objectives. So that's the what and the why. And so let me pause here and see if you have any questions.
No, that was a great introduction, and now I'm more curious than before. So, talking about the why and what, I'm more curious, what are the types of business processes? Like, do they differ from industry to industry? And how does one come up with an appropriate business process which is customizable to my needs?
Sure. That's a great question. And so depending on the type, and I'll talk a little bit about that, there can be some customization, some flavor of the vertical you're in, the industry you're in, but there are basically three main types of business processes. Think about the first type, which is the management processes, which help you at least set the strategy for whatever you're trying to achieve, which are related more to planning, to coordination, to performance management, basically, right? Any QBR that you've been to for any business function or any company or any strategic offsite that you've been to, that becomes sort of a management process, basically. The second type is operational processes. Now, these are the processes that actually go into generating value for your company, making a product, whether say it's it's a candy company making gummy bears, or it's a software company developing a platform. All the processes that go into developing that product essentially become your operational processes. Like as an example, when I was working at Intel, from sand or silicon to a microchip, there were about 300 processes that went into the overall manufacturing value chain here. And each of them was an operational process, basically. And then there are the supporting processes. Now, these, by virtue of their name, don't seem as important, but in reality, they are actually very, very critical. They're not exactly generating value, but they are actually enabling those operational processes to generate value. And if you don't follow these supporting processes, you could land up in some very funky places. From my personal experience, I remember when I joined Google and I joined the data center group, and Google data centers are like the size of mini cities. But to get into them also, to look at them, you have to clear a lot of security procedures. And the first time I was getting into a data center, I forgot to do one simple thing. I did everything, right? All the business processes I followed, got my biometrics done, got my badges correct. What I didn't do is I just didn't file a Jira request, basically, to get into a specific data center, which was part of the process. And so I get there, it was a bad day. I don't know, my eyes were not opening or something. My retina scan failed. As it failed, they looked up my records and they saw everything, but they saw I hadn't filled out one specific request, so they didn't know why I was there at the data center. And so I was taken to this dark, dingy room underneath, basically, in the basement of the data center, as they called it. And there were two guys who didn't seem as friendly as everybody else at Google, who came in and who explained to me the importance of business processes, basically, and following processes at Google. So long story short, what I'm trying to say is operational and management processes will bring the most visibility and the most value. But don't forget the support processes. They can actually get you in a very thick soup.
That's interesting because to hear someone speak about small dingy rooms in Google's data centers would actually keep it ingrained in someone's mind that, hey, business processes are really important. So how does it matter? Like you mentioned about the types of business processes. So how does it matter when you come to a product startup like Innovation? Do you think that there are certain lessons here that we most definitely need to take out?
Yeah, that's a great question here. So let's maybe think a little bit about how you define a business process, and from that certain insights will come out as to why they are important, basically. Because this question you ask is very loaded, there are a lot of places I see where business process at Innovator could actually help us as we get to the next level of performance here. But if I think about it, right, we are actually developing systems and tools that essentially enable healthcare industries to essentially, make sense of all the dirty data that they get. And then bring some intelligence out of that, and then slap some engagement layers which actually make our customers extremely successful, either through their health outcomes or through providing a very patient-centric experience to their customers. So the industry is engulfed with compliance and regulatory issues, and we need to be very, very clear when we are developing our processes that we are actually following those constraints that are put on our vertical to deliver the end product here. So in that same realm, right, when you think of a business process, the first thing that you need to do is you need to identify the problem you're trying to solve, basically. Again, it goes back to trying to answer the why. Once you do that, and once you have the problem in your head, then the next thing you need to do is you need to try to identify what are the outcomes that are going to tell you whether it's been successful or not. And then you simply start by, not literally, but, if you have access to a whiteboard, get on a whiteboard and start drawing out the process. And then once you start drawing out the process, you'll also see what are the outcomes you can actually measure that will tell you the success of the process and will actually in turn tell you whether you're actually solving the problem that you had initially defined. And then you design the process. Now, there's a couple of ways to design the process, again, depending on the industry that you're in. Say if you're in a heavy process or manufacturing industry, the way we used to do it at Intel when I started my career, we used to do these design of experiments, and each engineer was responsible for one step in making this microchip here, and each step had certain variables involved with that. So to optimize the process or design the process, you used to run experiments where you used to test out different ranges of the variable and used to come up with optimum conditions. But all industries are, of course, not manufacturing or driven by a linear value chain. There are also processes that are circular, that are iterative. If I think about the second process, again, coming back to the example of Google here, and it's funny, the one thing that I learned about Google, which which you'd never guess in the first instances, because nobody does mostly, is actually construction. The biggest internet software industry in the world. And I went in and learned about construction because I was part of the group which used to design and build all the data centers. And one of the processes that I was asked at one point to actually establish was some sort of a root cause analysis, post-mortem reliability kind of process on why certain projects could get delayed, basically could bust the schedule or basically go out of budget, because you're talking about huge capital projects that cost anything between $200 million to $600 million. Now, in this kind of a process, you don't have the luxury to do experiments. So then what you do to design this kind of a process, you bring various stakeholders in and you try to gather their input, right? You try to form a small team and you define the problem and the outcomes, and then you try to design the process based on their experience. But then there's also a third way you can do this, basically. Now, one example I can think of is in my previous role at Nutanix, where I started the customer success function, I needed to also establish a recruiting process, basically, for all the customer success managers that we were hiring, because they had a very unique profile. That's where I took inspiration from what I had learned about recruiting and hiring at McKinsey. McKinsey has a very regimented process to basically onboard a candidate, introduce a candidate, has very clear rounds on what you need to do. In fact, they are sometimes so prescriptive and they're made so clear to the candidates. It sometimes becomes a little counterproductive. Like, for example, I knew that, if I had essentially done well in one of the rounds, I would get a call on Monday. But if I was going to be told that, I'm not going to make it to the next round, I was going to be called on a Sunday. Now, there's no such thing that's documented, but because I'd heard about the process so much, these were the pattern recognitions that had come up there. And lo and behold, after my first round, I got a call on Sunday and I didn't answer it because I thought it was going to, be bad news. But then they left a voicemail there and I had actually passed the round. So sometimes it becomes a little counterproductive. But my point was this third layer comes in where you can learn from best practices from people who've done it to design that process. And once you've designed the process, you remove some waste of it, you shave off some fat from it, you make it a little bit lean, you train the people who are going to be the main stakeholders, and then you track the outcomes. And then you continuously revisit and improve these processes, basically. So given that wireframe, right, there's a lot of learnings that are there for Innovator in terms of how we do product development, how we do new product launches, or how we do maybe, root cause analysis of issues that have come up there. That's where I think, we will become from great to the best, basically, in a lot of categories.
That's amazing that you mentioned these different steps, and I was taking notes side by side. So just to reiterate what points you mentioned about the wireframing. So identify goals, analyze and map process, identify necessary and whatever can be chunked off, whatever fat can be shaved off, redundant activities, unnecessary activities, and redesign process to reach optimum results, and then define quantifiable outcomes or KPIs, and track and report on these outcomes, and then by virtue of them review, redesign and refine. Would that be the correct order of things in terms of wireframing any business?
Absolutely. Yeah, you nailed it right there. I think sometimes you can maybe define the outcomes a little bit before than after. But yes, exactly that. And then there are multiple ways to think about designing the process depending on the industry you're in. But yeah, that's a great summary. And then there's some secrets to success when you implement a process that I want to quickly touch base on also. Firstly, don't overthink it and don't basically over standardize it. Always leave some room for flexibility in your business process. Otherwise, it becomes too rigid and draconian, and it won't work. Secondly, put processes for the right things, right? Always make sure that they're going to bring any value here and not for the sake of processes. And thirdly, take people on that journey with you so that, you can avoid the resistance. It's almost like, when you try to change people, it's almost like the rules I use with my 2-year-old and 6-year-old also sometimes, I think. When you're establishing a process, there should be some best practices. You should role model that process. You should tell your kids, right, why you've put a process in place. So you should communicate that process to everybody else. You should train all the stakeholders, like I was saying, on that process, and you should have some sort of carrots and sticks basically to follow that process if that process is important. But always remember not to over-engineer a process too much and not to over-standardize it too much. Always leave some wiggle room in there.
I'm sure that's a great thing to look out for. Like, do not over-engineer the process. That's a great, outcome that I would remember from any like. Do you have any like personal experience there? Like you mentioned about kids, but is there anything else that you think you can remember right now about you did something and it just backfired?
Yeah, they say good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment, basically. So definitely there are places that I've remembered that is backfired. Back in Intel again, it's a very regimented company, and I have a lot of respect for that company. And they have this virtue of a copy exacting. No matter which factory you're in, which fab you're in, which lab you're in any part of the world, you'll produce the exact same chip with the exact same quality. And they've invested billions of dollars in that copy exact philosophy. But I was part of establishing this sort of this change control board at Intel. If you want to change the process, if you want to change the recipe at which your wafer cooks, you have to take it through a change control board process. And it was one of the first projects that I got on the business side, starting from engineer, and I was so eager to impress, basically. I thought I was going to make it so strict and rigorous that it easily added a week to an approval that came in, right? Because I thought I was emulating the values of Intel. Well, Intel's values weren't exactly that. They were very regimented about documented processes, but they were also very efficient. The result of that, when I first implemented that process, and I had the full sponsorship to implement that process, it suddenly I saw started causing a lot of delays in approvals. So the over-engineering of the process, all the checks I had put in to, basically cover for myself then, essentially ended up actually delaying all the innovation that was being pushed through this change tunnel, basically. And as a result of that, I was given pretty direct feedback at that time. There used to be this other philosophy at Intel. It used to be called constructive confrontation. I was confronted in a very constructive manner, where my head was almost bitten off for that process. But that's one example that comes to mind. And there's multitudes of examples where any changes or process I've put in place have not completely worked the way I had imagined them to be. But yeah, that's one of the biggest ones, because it was one of the first ones in my career that left a little bit of an indelible mark on me, to be very careful in the future.
And absolutely, we have seen the fantastic results. You have excelled in your career right now. You're the VP advisor, and now you are in the position where you can rightly guide us to the right stream here. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank you for this amazing session. And I'll hope that these techniques that we discussed are adopted by more and more professionals. And to our listeners, thank you for joining with us today. Any final words, Vikram?
No, it was a pleasure to be here, Shakti. Thanks for having me there. And, let's take Innovator to the next level from here.
Absolutely. So, guys, that was Vikram, and we were discussing about business processes today. Stay tuned for our next episode on effective communications, only here at Dialog Yoga. Have a great day.